Hi everybody, and welcome to this video on how to craft a conclusion to your essays. Now, conclusions are really tricky beasts because they tend to flow naturally from what you've already written in the essay. So it's quite tricky for me to give a clear checklist on what you should have in your conclusion. So this video is going to be a little bit more general than they are sometimes, and I would say that you follow the general principles, but make sure that what you're writing aligns with everything else that you've already said in the essay, and that it follows the natural flow of the argument. And that's my first point here in the excellence criteria. It's got to fit with the essay. It shouldn't just be a bolt-on, oh, in conclusion, I've already said this is my argument, the end. It's got to give a nuanced response to the question and address the big ideas and bring the essay to a natural ending place. So I'm going to model this using this question here on Jekyll and Hyde. And the question is, Stevenson's presentation of women in Jekyll and Hyde perpetuates gender stereotypes. To what extent do you agree? And this question stem indicates that there's going to be a range of responses to this question. So you might say, I completely agree, or I completely disagree, or it's more likely that you're going to be somewhere in between. So if I start off, I'm going to start with the connective. So therefore, and I'm going to answer the question directly. So therefore, to some extent, so with that, I'm responding to the question and I'm indicating that I don't entirely agree with it, but I'm somewhere on that spectrum between agree and disagree. So therefore, to some extent, Stevenson fails to challenge gender stereotypes as his female characters are usually submissive and dependent on the men around them. Okay, we're just talking about Jekyll and Hyde here because that's what the question is. So I've got a connective which indicates that we're drawing up to a conclusion. I've indicated that I'm somewhere on the spectrum that I mostly agree with the question. So Stevenson fails to challenge gender stereotypes as his female characters are usually submissive and dependent on the men around them. So I'm mostly in agreement with the question. In doing so, Stevenson confirms Victorian ideals of femininity, demonstrating the strength of such patriarchal ideologies. Okay, so there I'm addressing the big picture. I'm thinking about what the message is that the writer's trying to communicate in the text, or what the idea is that the writer challenges or confirms or considers in the text. And in this sense, we're talking about feminism, aren't we? We're talking about the representation of women. So we've got the strength of such patriarchal ideologies. Now, the one thing that I haven't done here is introduced a huge amount of nuance to my answer. And I want to do that because in literature, there's not always one clear answer. There's different ways of interpreting things. And in your essay, you'll probably have had a main line of argument, and then you'll have had a counter argument, and then you'll come back to the main line of argument again. So what I'm going to suggest here in order to inject a little bit of nuance into this is that actually there are strong women in Jekyll and Hyde. However, because of the way society treats them, that strength is diverted into quite an unpleasant way. So I'm going to say here, and here I'm thinking about the women that we see in chapter 1, where Hyde tramples a young girl, and then the women who are in the area respond by trying to attack Hyde. So they are strong. It's just that they're presented as being quite unpleasant at the same time. So how am I going to fit this in? In doing so, however, So I'm showing that this is my other line of the argument with that connective. However, there are occasional flickers of female strength in the novel, which hint at the possibility of an alternative mode of femininity which, unpleasant though these women might appear, reveals a certain level of female agency. Okay, so I'm going to get my highlighter, and if we have a read back through everything that I've written, make sure it makes sense. Always make sure that you proofread what you've read and that it does flow and that it does make sense. So let's zoom in a little bit on this. So we've got therefore. So my connective is signposting the reader the direction that my argument is taking. Then, to some extent, so I'm linking back to the question and I'm showing that I'm somewhere on the spectrum of agree to disagree. And then Stevenson fails to challenge gender stereotypes. Seems quite a stark statement per Stevenson. So again, gender stereotypes, I'm linking that back to the question and I'm using some of the wording of the question to show that I'm really trying to address the issues that it raises. And then we see here, female characters are usually submissive and dependent, so I'm trying to use quite precise vocabulary. I'm not describing the woman as weak, I'm describing them as submissive because the text is about maybe their intellectual weakness rather than just their physical weakness. So submissive and dependent on the men around them. In doing so, Stevenson confirms. So I'm using analytical verbs here, and I've done a separate video on analytical verbs that you can check it out. But Stevenson confirms Victorian ideals of femininity, demonstrating the strength of such patriarchal ideologies. So here, I'm zooming out, I'm looking at the big picture, the message that Stevenson has about society, or how Stevenson's text feeds into social issues. Then I've got another connective, however, so I'm showing that I'm adding a little bit of nuance here. I'm changing the direction of my essay ever so slightly. However, there are occasional flickers of female strength in the novel, which hint at the possibility of an alternative mode of femininity, which, unpleasant though these women might appear, reveals a certain level of female agency. So I am injecting a different side there. I'm not going to leave it there because that then... It's, I don't know, like a cake that you haven't iced or something. It looks a little bit unfinished because I've got one line of argument and then I've got another line of argument and I've kind of not tidied up the loose ends. I've not gone back to my original line of argument. I would say if your original line of argument is the X, your other side of the argument is your O, always kind of seal off your essay with the X. Always make sure that you've tidied it up so that your line of argument is really strong. So I'm going to say overall, I'm going to change that. So having said this, overall, it is men who are the dominant concern in the text. Okay, so I've gone back, injected a bit of nuance with my O, but I've gone back to my X and I've sealed off my essay and I've tidied it off neatly. Okay, so I hope that that was useful in some way, and even if this particular example doesn't apply to you, make sure you use these excellence criteria and primarily make sure that your conclusion flows from your essay and doesn't look like a bolt-on at the end.